Any military pilot on board?
The early morning sun cast long shadows across the Denver International Airport terminal as Sarah Mitchell pulled her small carry-on behind her, her eyes already fixed on the massive Boeing 737 waiting at Gate B-47. Most children her age would be distracted by the airport's shops or the novelty of traveling, but Sarah was different. At 11 years old, she had already logged more flight hours studying aircraft systems than most recreational pilots experienced in their first year of flying. "Come on, Sarah," her mother called gently, one hand on her shoulder. "We need to check in at the gate." Sarah barely heard her. She was too mesmerized by the aircraft itself, the silver fuselage gleaming under the fluorescent airport lights, the blue tail with its distinctive airline markings, the careful dance of ground crew members performing their pre-flight checks. To most people, it was just a plane. To Sarah, it was a masterpiece of engineering, every rivet and panel telling a story of human ingenuity and precision. Her father, Colonel James Mitchell, walked alongside them with the characteristic posture of someone who had spent decades in military aviation. Even in civilian clothes, there was something unmistakably pilot about him. The way he scanned the runway with practiced eyes, the confident stride, the way he glanced at the sky as if mentally calculating wind speeds and weather patterns. He smiled at his daughter's obvious fascination with the aircraft. "That's our ride," he said warmly. "Beautiful bird, isn't she?" "Boeing 737-800, Sarah recited immediately, her voice carrying the confidence of someone stating established fact. Capacity 189 passengers, cruising speed of about 460 miles per hour, 4 hydraulic systems with triple redundancy, Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines, maximum range of approximately 3,115 nautical miles. This particular model has been in service since 2009, based on the condition of the livery." Her father laughed, that familiar sound of pride mixed with amazement. "Your memory is incredible. Most pilots don't remember specifications that precisely." "Most pilots didn't have you as a teacher," Sarah said simply. This was true. Her father had retired from active Air Force duty 5 years ago, after suffering a shoulder injury that made continued combat flying impossible. Rather than sink into disappointment, he channeled his passion into his daughter. Every evening since her 6th birthday, they'd spent at least an hour in their home study, surrounded by aviation manuals, flight simulator equipment, and maps of airways and navigation routes. While other fathers taught their children to play baseball or ride bicycles, Colonel Mitchell taught his daughter the intricacies of aerodynamic lift, the protocols of instrument flying, the decision-making processes that governed aviation safety. The family proceeded through the boarding process. Sarah clutched her worn notebook, the one that had become as essential to her as her passport. Inside its pages were detailed sketches of aircraft she'd studied, notes on the physics of flight, hand-drawn diagrams of hydraulic systems, and margins filled with calculations she'd performed to verify facts she'd read in her collection of aviation textbooks. The notebook was a shrine to her passion. Their seats were in the middle section, rows 14 through 16. As they settled into 14C, 14D, and 14E, Sarah immediately turned to the window. She could see the continuation of the aircraft's exterior, the wing flaps, the landing gear, the intricate system of maintenance panels that revealed the complexity hidden beneath the smooth exterior. "Window seat for our window girl," her mother said, smoothing Sarah's dark hair affectionately. "Remember when you were 3 years old and thought we couldn't fly because you couldn't see wings on the car?" Sarah smiled at the memory, but she was already reaching into her backpack. She withdrew a thick book, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, a gift from her father for her 10th birthday. The edges were dog-eared from repeated reading. She'd already completed it twice, and this would be her 3rd pass. But there were always new details to absorb, new connections to make between concepts. "Studying during the flight?" her father asked, settling into the seat beside her. "Just reviewing," Sarah replied. "I want to make sure I understand the emergency procedures perfectly. Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "You've told me that most plane crashes are caused by a combination of factors, never just one thing, but the hydraulic systems have so much redundancy. Could all four systems really fail?" Her father leaned back, considering the question seriously. He never talked down to Sarah, never dismissed her questions as beyond her understanding. Theoretically, all four systems are independent. The chance of simultaneous failure across all four is extraordinarily remote. The Boeing 737 has been flying for over 50 years with an excellent safety record because of engineering like that. "But not impossible," Sarah said, and it wasn't really a question. "No," her father admitted. "Not impossible. In aviation, we have to plan for the impossible. That's why we have procedures for contingencies that might never happen." Sarah nodded, returning her attention to her book. But her mind was already deep in thought, visualizing hydraulic systems, imagining scenarios, running through procedures. Her father watched her with that familiar expression, something between pride and wonder at the mind his daughter possessed. The cabin gradually filled with passengers. Families with young children, business travelers with laptops already open, elderly couples holding hands, college students with backpacks. Sarah observed them all with quiet curiosity, wondering where they were going, what their stories were. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, demonstrating safety features and answering questions with professional smiles. The pre-flight announcements began, the standard script about safety procedures, emergency exits, oxygen masks. Most passengers barely paid attention, already settling into phones or tablets. But Sarah listened intently, comparing the verbal procedures to the diagrams she'd studied in her pilot manuals. Everything matched. Everything was precise. Everything was designed to keep people safe. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 447, with service to Los Angeles International Airport. Our flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. We're expecting smooth skies and pleasant weather throughout our journey." Sarah closed her eyes as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. She felt the characteristic lurch, heard the distant whine of the auxiliary power unit, sensed the precise mechanical movements of the ground crew. In her mind's eye, she could see exactly what was happening beneath the fuselage, the tow bar connecting them to the tug, the choreography of ground control and flight crew working in perfect synchronization. As the 737 began taxiing toward the runway, Sarah opened her eyes and pressed her face closer to the window. The runway stretched ahead of them, the lights marking the way forward. She thought of all the pilots who had flown this route countless times before her, and of the dreams she held, dreams of one day sitting in that captain's seat, of joining a lineage of aviators. She had no idea, as the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the Colorado sky, that today would be unlike any other day. She had no idea that her years of study, her father's patient teachings, and her own burning passion for aviation would be tested in a way that no simulator could prepare her for. As Flight 447 climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah watched the earth fall away beneath her, her notebook resting on her lap, her heart full of wonder and possibility. The future stretched before her as vast and open as the sky itself. She was just a girl with a dream. She had no idea she was about to become a hero. Flight 447 had been airborne for just over 3 hours when Sarah looked up from her book and took in the serene landscape of the cabin around her. The aircraft had reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and the world below had become nothing more than a patchwork of clouds and distant landscape features that blended into abstract art at this elevation. The morning turbulence they'd experienced during climb-out had completely subsided, replaced by the smooth, almost imperceptible glide of a massive aircraft suspended in the upper atmosphere. Her mother dozed peacefully in the seat beside her head tilted against the cabin wall with a small travel pillow providing minimal comfort. Sarah watched her with affection, noting how the slight vibration of the engines had a soporific effect on most passengers. Her father sat across the aisle in the middle seat, completely absorbed in his novel, a Tom Clancy thriller about submarine warfare. Every few minutes, he'd turn a page with that same methodical precision he applied to everything else. Occasionally, he'd glance over at Sarah with that familiar expression of quiet approval, as if simply being present with his daughter was enough to make him happy. The cabin itself was a study in peaceful monotony. In the rows ahead of them, most passengers had settled into the routine of long-distance air travel. A businessman in 12C had spread an impressive array of documents across his tray table, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Sarah could see the intensity in his focus. Whatever corporate crisis or business deal occupied his mind seemed entirely consuming. Behind them, a young couple held hands, their heads closed together as they whispered and laughed about something only they found amusing. They were clearly on a romantic getaway, oblivious to everything except each other. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with the efficiency of a well-orchestrated ballet. Every movement was purposeful, every gesture practiced through hundreds of previous flights. One attendant pushed the beverage cart down the center aisle, offering passengers drinks and snacks. Another stood at the rear galley, preparing meals for the first-class section. A third checked the lavatory doors, ensuring everything remained in proper working order. They were professionals doing what they did best, making the flying experience seamless and safe for everyone aboard. Sarah had always found the flight attendants fascinating. They possessed a unique kind of authority in the cabin, trained to handle everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers to mechanical problems. They were safety experts in their own right, prepared for contingencies that most passengers never thought about. She wondered if any of them realized they were working alongside an 11-year-old girl who had probably studied emergency procedures more thoroughly than many of them had. The cabin lights were dimmed to a comfortable level that encouraged rest without complete darkness. Through the window, Sarah could see the brilliant blue of the upper atmosphere, that particular shade of blue that existed only at high altitude, a color that never appeared in the sky when viewed from the ground. It was one of her favorite aspects of flying, this unique perspective available only to those who rose above the terrestrial plane. She could also see a portion of the right wing, the flap systems visible from her vantage point. Everything looked perfect, exactly as it should appear on a routine flight. The engines hummed their steady, reassuring song, a sound that most people on their first few flights found vaguely unsettling, but which Sarah found incredibly comforting. Those 4 engines represented the only thing keeping 189 people alive at this altitude. In the vacuum of commercial aviation, failure wasn't an option. Every system was redundant. Every critical component had a backup. Every procedure had been tested thousands of times. She returned to her book, turning to a chapter on advanced navigation systems. The text discussed inertial measurement units, which were instruments that could track an aircraft's position based on acceleration and gravity. Sarah found herself visualizing the mathematical concepts involved, imagining the sensors embedded within the aircraft's structure, constantly calculating and recalculating position data. It was the kind of thing that most people would find impossibly boring, but to Sarah, it was absolutely fascinating, evidence of human ingenuity solving complex problems. The time displayed on the cabin's moving map showed they were making excellent progress. They'd already covered a significant portion of the route from Denver to Los Angeles. The aircraft was operating in its optimal cruise configuration, engines at the precisely calculated thrust to maintain altitude while maximizing fuel efficiency. Everything was running beautifully, exactly as it had been designed to run. Around 12:45 p.m. local time, The captain's voice came through the cabin speakers, clear, calm, and deeply professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and we're making excellent time. We're expecting to encounter a slight wind pattern in about 30 minutes as we pass over the Arizona border, but nothing that should cause us any concern. It'll be barely noticeable. Current weather conditions in Los Angeles show clear skies and pleasant temperatures. We anticipate an on-time arrival at LAX. Thank you for flying with us today." The announcement was routine, delivered with that characteristic combination of authority and reassurance that good pilots cultivated. Sarah's father glanced over at her with a slight smile, acknowledging that they'd both heard the same professional competence in the captain's voice. This was how it was supposed to sound, he seemed to be saying. This was what safety sounded like. Sarah's mother stirred slightly at the sound of the captain's voice, raising her head briefly to check that everything was normal. Seeing nothing alarming, she repositioned her pillow and drifted back into sleep, her body recognizing that this was one of the safest places on Earth, suspended in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, and trusted to skilled professionals trained for every conceivable emergency. The cabin settled back into its peaceful routine. The businessman continued working on his documents. The young couple continued their whispered conversation. The flight attendants continued their duties. Sarah continued reading about navigation systems, her mind quietly absorbing information that she didn't know would soon become critically important. Outside the windows, the sky remained brilliantly clear. The aircraft maintained its steady altitude and course, its systems operating in perfect harmony. The 4 hydraulic systems that kept the aircraft maneuverable and safe circulated fluid through their intricate networks without any indication of stress. The engines, the avionics, the electrical systems, everything hummed along in perfect synchronization. To every observer on Flight 447, this was simply another day in commercial aviation. Routine, safe, predictable. The kind of flight that happened thousands of times a day across the country, unremarkable and taken for granted. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer monitored their instruments with practiced vigilance, watching for any deviation from normal. Everything appeared normal. Everything was normal. Sarah had no idea that this peaceful moment, this calm before the storm, represented the last moments of normalcy that Flight 447 would experience. She was simply a girl on an airplane, reading about aviation, traveling with her family, unaware that the next 2 hours would change her life forever. She turned another page in her book, completely oblivious to the fact that soon, her years of study, her father's endless teachings, and her own remarkable intellect would be tested in the most dramatic and terrifying way imaginable. For now, there was only peace, only safety, only the serene sound of powerful engines carrying 189 people toward Los Angeles on what promised to be an uneventful, forgettable flight. The first indication that something was wrong came at 1:47 p.m., exactly 14 minutes after the captain's reassuring announcement about the minor weather pattern ahead. It started as a vibration, subtle at first, barely noticeable to someone not trained to recognize the signature sounds and movements of aircraft in normal operation. But Sarah's eyes snapped open the moment it began. She'd heard her father describe this sensation 100 times, the distinctive feel of an aircraft deviating from its established flight envelope. The vibration intensified. It wasn't the smooth, rhythmic pulsing of normal engine operation. This was something different, something wrong. Sarah's book slipped from her lap as her entire body went rigid. Around her, she could see the other passengers beginning to react. The businessman's pen paused mid-document. The young couple stopped their whispered conversation and exchanged glances. An elderly woman, too, rose ahead, gripped her armrest. Her mother's eyes opened with confusion. "Honey, did you kick the seat?" "No," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Something's wrong." Her father had already detected it, too. She could see his body language change instantly, from relaxed and absorbed to tensely alert. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the aircraft's behavior. His military background was showing, that ingrained ability to separate normal from abnormal, to categorize threats and prioritize responses. The vibration became more pronounced, no longer subtle or deniable. The overhead luggage compartments began to rattle. An oxygen mask, not deployed, but one that had been improperly stowed, fell into the aisle with a plastic clatter that sounded impossibly loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. The aircraft's movement was becoming more pronounced, and Sarah could feel it in her bones, in her inner ear, in that instinctive part of the human brain that understood, on some primitive level, that something fundamental had changed. Then the alarm came. It wasn't like the gentle chime that announced a captain's announcement or the soft signal of a call button. This was different, a sharp, piercing wail that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the aircraft itself. Not urgent enough to suggest imminent disaster, but insistent enough that every passenger on Flight 447 immediately understood that this was not a normal situation. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. A child in the back rows started crying, a high-pitched wail that cut through the alarm and the shouts. A woman several rows ahead gasped audibly. The businessman's documents scattered across his tray table as he grabbed for anything secure. Conversations turned to panic questions. What's happening? Is this normal? Oh God, oh God, oh God. Sarah's mother gripped her daughter's hand, her fingernails digging slightly into Sarah's skin. Sarah, what's happening? Sarah's mind was operating on two levels simultaneously. One part of her was terrified, an 11-year-old girl confronting a very real threat to her safety. But another part, the part that had spent hours studying aircraft systems, analyzing procedures, reading accident reports, was analyzing the data. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. Unsecured items tumbled throughout the cabin. A coffee cup that a flight attendant had been carrying shattered against the cabin wall, spraying dark liquid across the cream-colored interior. The attendant stumbled, catching herself against a seat back. More screams. The young couple clung to each other, eyes wide with fear. Sarah's father had his hand on her headrest, and she could feel his tension through that simple point of contact. "Stay calm," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what was happening and understood that it was serious. Very serious. The aircraft bucked again, and this time the movement was sustained. The overhead compartments popped open, spilling carry-on luggage into the aisles and onto passenger laps. A woman's purse flew through the air. Someone's roller bag tumbled end over end before wedging against the lavatory door. The aircraft's exterior structure groaned, an awful metal-on-metal sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered pure, primal fear in the listening passengers. The alarm continued its relentless wailing, the sound somehow more frightening than any voice communication could be. Silence might have been more terrifying in its own way, but this constant alerting sound was designed to convey urgency, and it was achieving that goal with devastating effectiveness. Sarah's analytical mind began cataloging the symptoms, the pattern of the vibration, the particular quality of the groaning, the way the aircraft wasn't responding normally to what she assumed were control inputs from the flight deck. She'd studied accident reports, the calm, technical accounts of what had gone wrong in past incidents. She knew that multiple system failures were extraordinarily rare but not impossible. The question was, what system, and could it be recovered? The hydraulic system, she found herself saying aloud, her voice small but certain. Her father's eyes met hers and she saw confirmation there. He understood. He'd flown aircraft for 3 decades. He knew the signatures of failure. The aircraft shuddered again, and this time the movement was more pronounced. Gravity seemed to behave erratically as the massive machine struggled against whatever was afflicting its systems. Sarah could feel the G-forces shifting, her stomach floating as if the aircraft were descending more rapidly than normal. Her mother squeezed her hand so tightly it hurt. A flight attendant had managed to steady herself against a row of seats. Her face was pale, her professional composure visibly shattered. "Everyone remain calm," she called out, but her voice was trembling, undermining the message. "Everyone please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts securely." The passengers who were still standing scrambled frantically to comply, grabbing seat backs for purchase as the aircraft continued to buck and shudder. An elderly man fell back into his seat hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. A child's backpack fell onto a passenger's head. The sense of controlled chaos was breaking down into something approaching true panic. The alarm continued its incessant wailing. Sarah closed her eyes and visualized the aircraft systems. The 4 independent hydraulic systems that provided the muscle for flight control surfaces, the backups, the emergency procedures. Her father had made her recite them dozens of times. "What do you do if you lose hydraulic pressure?" he would ask during their evening sessions. And she would respond, methodically working through the procedures, understanding not just the steps but the reasoning behind them. The aircraft lurched again, and this time it was accompanied by a sickening sensation of losing altitude. The nose pitched down slightly. The alarm intensified if that were somehow possible. Oxygen masks finally deployed throughout the cabin, the yellow masks dropping like plastic jellyfish from the overhead compartments, swinging on their tubing in the turbulent air. Chaos, complete undeniable chaos. But Sarah's mind remained clear, focused, analytical. She looked at her father and saw her own determination reflected in his expression. 3 hours of study on this very aircraft, years of lessons, all of it suddenly, shockingly relevant. "What happens now?" her mother sobbed, holding the oxygen mask to her face. Sarah didn't answer because she didn't know. But she was about to find out, and every instinct, every hour of preparation, was telling her that she would need to survive what came next. The aircraft continued to struggle against mechanical failure at 35,000 feet, and Sarah Mitchell, an 11-year-old girl who had dreamed of flying, suddenly realized that her dream was about to take on a terrifyingly literal meaning. In the flight deck of Flight 447, Captain Robert Hayes was experiencing the worst moments of his 32-year aviation career. His hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. Every muscle in his body tensed as he fought to keep the massive aircraft stable. Beside him, First Officer Maria Chen was frantically manipulating switches and monitoring the cascade of warning lights that had turned the normally calm cockpit into a hellscape of flashing red and amber alerts. "We've lost primary hydraulic pressure," Chen reported, her voice steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. She was a consummate professional, a 15-year veteran of commercial aviation, but even she had never encountered anything like this. Primary and secondary systems both showing critical pressure loss, pressures dropping in tertiary. Hayes's jaw clenched. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Boeing 737-800 had 4 independent hydraulic systems specifically designed so that no single failure point could compromise aircraft safety. Yet here they were, watching system after system begin to fail in a cascade that defied probability. In his 3 decades of flying, he'd never heard of a scenario where 3 hydraulic systems would fail simultaneously. "What's the cause?" he demanded, his eyes flickering between the attitude indicator and the hydraulic system readouts. "Unknown," Chen replied, her fingers dancing across the overhead panel, checking and rechecking system status. No indication of impact damage, no fire warnings, no hydraulic fluid temperature anomalies. It's like the systems are just draining. The aircraft bucked again as Hayes fought to maintain control. The elevator surfaces, the horizontal control surfaces on the tail that controlled pitch, were becoming sluggish. The ailerons, the surfaces that controlled roll, were responding only partially to his control inputs. Each movement of the yoke was producing less and less effect, like trying to steer a car as the power steering fluid drained away. The flight engineer, actually a flight system monitoring computer in this modern aircraft, was screaming at them through its various alarms and warnings. The first officer was already running through emergency procedures, her hands steady even as her mind raced through the implications. They had backup systems, but those backups were dependent on hydraulic power too, if they lost all 4 systems. "Captain, we have control degradation," Chen said, stating the obvious but necessary fact. "I know," Hayes replied tersely. "Flight control computer is compensating, but we're losing authority fast. How much hydraulic fluid are we losing?" Chen checked the quantity indicators. Quaternary system is now showing 50% pressure. Tertiary is down to 30%. This was bad. This was catastrophically bad. Hayes made a decision. He couldn't fix this problem from the flight deck, not with his training, not with standard procedures. The emergency had gone beyond the normal scope of what pilots were trained to handle. They needed help. They needed someone with specialized knowledge of hydraulic system architecture and emergency procedures. "Flight attendant, initiate an all-call," he commanded through the intercom, his voice steady and authoritative, the voice that he used when he needed to project confidence even when terror was gnawing at his insides. "And get me a report on cabin conditions." The lead flight attendant, Maria Gonzalez, responded immediately. She was in her 50s, had been flying for 28 years, and had the kind of composure that came from genuine experience. "Captain, cabin is in distress. Passengers panicked. We've contained most of them in their seats. What do you need?" "An announcement," Hayes said. "I need to speak to the passengers directly." He took a deep breath, something every pilot learned to do in emergency situations. Control your breathing, control your heart rate, control your mind. The moment panic entered the equation was the moment everything fell apart. He keyed the public address system. His voice, calm and measured, began to echo through the cabin. "Attention all passengers. This is your captain. We are currently experiencing a critical system malfunction that requires immediate professional assistance." In the cabin, the noise level dropped instantly. Passengers who had been screaming or crying fell silent, transfixed by the captain's words. This was real. This wasn't panic. This was confirmation from an authority figure that something genuinely catastrophic was happening. "We are looking for any military pilot or aviation professional aboard this aircraft," Captain Hayes continued, his voice never wavering. "If you have military pilot experience or professional aviation expertise, please press your call button immediately." The words hung in the air. Sarah was listening to them, as was everyone else on Flight 447. The captain was asking for help. The captain, the man trained for exactly this scenario, was asking for someone else to save them. In seat 12A, a retired Marine major's hand went up. In seat 28D, a commercial airline pilot on vacation pressed his call button. In seat 5C, a retired Navy aviator stood up. Throughout the cabin, hands rose hesitantly, people uncertain whether their qualifications met whatever crisis the captain was facing. But Captain Hayes wasn't done. The situation was still deteriorating. He could feel it in the way the aircraft was responding, or rather, failing to respond, to his control inputs. "This is not a routine situation," he continued, and for the first time, a note of genuine urgency entered his voice. "We are looking for someone with specific knowledge of hydraulic system backups and emergency procedures. This is not about general pilot experience. We need someone who understands advanced hydraulic architecture. Please, if you have that expertise, press your call button now." The hands that had risen hesitated. This was more specific. This was beyond general pilot knowledge. A commercial airline pilot could fly a 737 for 30 years and never need to know the intricate details of backup hydraulic systems. That level of knowledge required either military training in a combat aircraft environment where redundancy was critical, or someone who had specialized extensively in aircraft systems engineering. In the cockpit, Hayes gripped the yoke even tighter. The aircraft was now in degraded mode. The flight control computer was doing its best to compensate, but they were approaching a point where normal control would become impossible. He had maybe 10 minutes, 15 if they were lucky, before they wouldn't be able to keep the aircraft stable. The alarms continued their incessant wailing, a sonic reminder that they were running out of time. Back in the cabin, most of the raised hands were lowering. The retired military pilots and the commercial aviator on vacation were looking at each other with expressions of helplessness. They knew how to fly a plane, but they didn't know what the captain was really asking for. Hayes's knuckles were white on the yoke. First Officer Chen had stopped calling out data and was simply staring at the deteriorating system readouts. The flight engineer's computer was running through backup procedures, trying to find any solution in its programmed algorithms. "Captain," Chen said quietly, "if we lose quaternary system, we're looking at manual reversion procedures." Hayes understood. Manual reversion meant flying the aircraft with pure mechanical linkages, no hydraulic assistance. The control forces required would be enormous. It might be possible for him to maintain basic control long enough to attempt an emergency landing, but the margin for error would be zero. He didn't know that in row 14, an 11-year-old girl was slowly raising her hand. He didn't know that her entire life of studying aircraft systems, memorizing procedures, and absorbing her father's detailed lessons had prepared her for exactly this moment. He didn't know that salvation was about to come from the most unexpected source in the cabin. All he knew was that his aircraft was dying, his options were running out, and time was running short. The cabin fell into a state of suspended tension as Captain Hayes's second announcement faded. The specific request for knowledge about hydraulic system backups and emergency procedures hung in the air like an unanswered prayer. Most passengers sat frozen, waiting to see if anyone would respond to this increasingly desperate call. The retired Marine Major in 12A was conferring quietly with his wife, shaking his head. The commercial airline pilot in 28D was staring at the ceiling, his expression troubled. The Navy aviator in 5C had slowly lowered his hand, recognition clear in his face that the captain was asking for something beyond his expertise. Sarah felt her father's hand on her shoulder. She turned to look at him, and in that moment an entire conversation happened without words. His eyes held understanding. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what she was about to do, and despite the terror that must have been flooding through him as a father, despite the instinct to protect his daughter from danger, he also recognized something else. She was prepared for this in a way that no one else on this aircraft was. Her mother grabbed her wrist. "Sarah, no, absolutely not." "Mom," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady in a way that seemed impossible for an 11-year-old girl facing an aviation emergency. "The captain needs someone who understands the backup procedures. Dad taught me. I can do this." "You're 11 years old," her mother said, desperation rising in her voice. "You're a child. They need a real." "There is no real expert here," her father said softly, and there was something in his voice, a note of agonized pride, that made Sarah's mother look at him in shock. "James," she started, but he shook his head. "If anyone on this aircraft understands those backup procedures, it's our daughter," he said, and the captain wouldn't have asked if they had another option. Sarah's hand rose slowly. It trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment, the understanding that she was about to step into a role that no child should ever have to fill. Around her, other passengers noticed. Heads turned. Eyes widened. A woman gasped audibly. The flight attendant call button light illuminated above seat 14C, joining several others that had already been pressed. But this one was different. As Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt, standing up in the aisle, The cabin erupted in whispered reactions. A middle-aged man in row 15 actually laughed, a sound of disbelief rather than humor. An elderly woman squinted, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Sarah, sit down," a voice called from somewhere in the cabin. "We need real help." Sarah ignored the comment. She was focused entirely on moving toward the nearest flight attendant call point. Her legs felt slightly unsteady, partly from the continuing turbulence, partly from adrenaline, but she forced herself to move with purpose. She'd spent her entire young life studying for moments like this without knowing it. Now the moment had arrived. The lead flight attendant, Maria Gonzalez, was making her way through the cabin checking on passengers when she saw the small girl standing in the aisle, her hand raised. For a moment, she simply stared, wondering if this was some kind of error in communication. Children didn't press call buttons about aviation emergencies. Children didn't volunteer to help with hydraulic system problems. "Excuse me," Sarah said, looking up at the flight attendant with surprising composure. "The captain asked for someone with knowledge of hydraulic system backups. I have that knowledge. My father, Colonel James Mitchell, taught me." Gonzalez looked back at the man in the seat, who nodded slowly. She saw the weight of this decision in his expression, a father allowing his daughter to do something that terrified him because he understood that she might be their only hope. "How old are you?" Gonzalez asked, though she could see the answer clearly written on Sarah's young face. 11, Sarah replied, "but I've studied the Boeing 737-800 emergency procedures extensively. I've trained on flight simulators. I understand the hydraulic architecture. Please, the captain needs help." Gonzalez made a decision that would later be analyzed in every pilot training program in the country. She pressed the intercom to the flight deck. "Captain, we have someone volunteering. They have knowledge of hydraulic backup systems." A pause, then, "Anyone with pilot experience?" "No, sir," Gonzalez replied, and she took a breath before continuing. "It's an 11-year-old girl. Her father is a retired Air Force colonel and apparently has trained her extensively in aircraft systems." The pause that followed seemed to last an eternity. In that silence, Sarah could imagine the disbelief in the cockpit. The captain, who was running out of options, who had made a desperate plea, must have been hearing something that seemed impossible. "Send her," Hayes finally responded, and those two words carried the weight of absolute desperation. He would take help from anywhere at this point. Sarah moved toward the cockpit, and the cabin's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some passengers actually gasped. A man in row 12 half stood, as if to protest. A child in the back rows called out, "Why is that girl going to the cockpit?" causing her mother to hush her urgently. Sarah's mother's face was white, her hands covering her mouth. Her father watched with an expression of complicated emotions, pride, fear, hope, and desperation all mixed together. As Sarah passed his seat, he reached out and squeezed her hand one final time. "You've got this," he said quietly. "You know this material better than anyone. Trust your training." Sarah nodded, unable to find words. The flight attendant guided her forward through the first-class cabin toward the cockpit door. Each step felt surreal. She'd imagined the cockpit 1,000 times, but never like this. Never in an emergency. Never as someone whose knowledge might make the difference between survival and catastrophe. As they approached the cockpit door, another massive shudder ran through the aircraft. Passengers cried out. Sarah caught herself against the armrest of a seat but didn't break stride. She could feel the aircraft struggling, feel the degradation in its control authority. The captain wasn't exaggerating the severity of the situation. The flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door and waited for it to open. When Captain Hayes's face appeared, he did a visible double-take. His eyes, lined with stress and exhaustion despite the flight having only been in progress for a few hours, widened in shock as he took in the reality of the volunteer standing before him. "Come in," he said after a moment, "quickly." Sarah stepped into the cockpit, and the door closed behind her. Through the small window in the cockpit door, passengers who had craned their necks to see could only get a glimpse of her standing among the sophisticated instrumentation and experienced pilots. An 11-year-old girl in her casual clothes, stepping into a world that seemed impossibly complex and dangerous. But as she looked at the instruments, at the flashing lights and warning displays, Sarah's fear transformed into something else. It transformed into focus, into clarity, into the absolute certainty that she knew what needed to be done. Captain Hayes studied her face for a long moment. He saw no hysteria, no confusion. He saw a child who was terrified but controlled, a child who understood, on some level, what she had volunteered for. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Mitchell, and I think I know how to save your airplane." Cockpit was a sensory overload for someone Sarah's age, though her extensive study had prepared her intellectually for what she was seeing. The instrument panel stretched across in front of Captain Hayes and First Officer Chen like a constellation of lights and gauges, some glowing green for normal operation, others flashing amber or red to indicate system failures. The alarms continued their insistent wailing, a constant reminder that they were operating in a state of emergency. The smell of aviation fuel and electronics mixed with something else, the sharp tang of stress sweat from the pilots who had been fighting this battle for what felt like hours, but had probably only been minutes. Captain Robert Hayes looked at Sarah with an expression that cycled through disbelief, resignation, and finally, desperate hope. He was a man trained for every conceivable emergency, but he'd never trained for this, accepting technical guidance from a child while flying an aircraft with failing hydraulic systems. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Tell me what you see." Sarah moved closer to the instrument panel, her small frame dwarfed by the vast array of switches, gauges, and displays. Her eyes scanned the hydraulic system readouts with the focus of someone who had studied these exact instruments in simulator training. "Primary hydraulic system is completely lost," she said, pointing with a steady finger at the pressure gauge that read 0. "Secondary is following. That's your A and B systems. Tertiary, C system, shows critical pressure loss and you're still bleeding pressure in quaternary, the D system." First Officer Maria Chen's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't a panicked child reciting information she'd half remembered. This was someone speaking with technical precision about systems that most commercial pilots never needed to understand in detail. "That's correct," Captain Hayes confirmed, and Sarah could hear the edge of desperate hope in his voice. "The aircraft is in degraded mode. The flight control computer is compensating as much as it can, but I'm losing control authority. We're approaching a point where we won't be able to maintain stable flight." Sarah's mind was racing, but her exterior remained calm. She'd practiced this 100 times with her father in their home flight simulator, analyzing system failures, working through emergency procedures, understanding not just what to do, but why each step was necessary. "There's an emergency isolation procedure," Sarah said. She turned to look at Captain Hayes directly. "You have to reroute the backup accumulator before you reinitialize the remaining systems. If you don't sequence it correctly, the electrical load could spike and cascade into total electrical failure." Hayes and Chen exchanged a glance. Chen's eyes widened slightly, recognition that this 11-year-old girl was not only knowledgeable, but was understanding the full scope of the problem at a level that went beyond simple memorization. "We know the procedure exists," Hayes said carefully, "but it's in the manual, and the manual procedure for this specific failure scenario was never fully tested in the real world. You seem to have specific knowledge about it." "My father walked me through it," Sarah explained, and she could hear the slight tremor in her voice now, not from fear but from the intensity of the moment. "He made me understand not just the steps but the reasoning. The backup accumulator holds pressurized nitrogen that can restore pressure in the D system, the quaternary system, long enough for you to manually bypass the failed pump system and re-establish controlled hydraulic pressure. First Officer Chen was already reaching for her emergency procedures manual, but Sarah shook her head slightly. "You don't have time to read it," she said. "The manual procedure is written for trained pilots with time to think. You need the accelerated version. The sequence is critical." Captain Hayes made a decision. "Tell us what to do, step by step." Sarah took a breath. This was it. This was the moment where everything she'd learned, everything her father had taught her, would either save 189 people or become the most catastrophic failure of her young life. "First, you need to isolate the primary system completely," she said, pointing to a series of switches on the overhead panel. "The isolation switch, it should be marked clearly. You're going to hold it in the off position for exactly 3 seconds. Not 2, not 4, 3. Captain Hayes reached for the overhead panel without hesitation. His hand moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades operating aircraft systems under stress. He found the switch, a large purple lever, and positioned his hand on it. "Count it for me," he said to Sarah. Sarah nodded. 3, 2, 1, mark, now hold it. 1, 2, 3, release. Hayes released the switch. The instrument panel flickered momentarily as the primary system disconnected from the aircraft's hydraulic network. "Good," Sarah continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Now, First Officer Chen, you need to access the backup accumulator valve. It should be behind your station. It's a red-handled valve with a pressure gauge beneath it." Chen was already moving, unbuckling from her seat and reaching behind her position. The aircraft shuddered again, a violent motion that almost made her lose her balance. Sarah gripped a nearby panel to steady herself. "I've got it," Chen called out. "Red handle, pressure gauge showing 1,200 psi." "Perfect," Sarah said. "That's what we need. Now, here's the critical part. You're going to open that valve, but you're going to do it slowly. If you open it too quickly, the pressure surge could damage the remaining systems." "How slowly?" Chen asked, and Sarah could hear the trust in her voice, not because Sarah was an adult, but because Sarah was speaking with certainty about technical matters that mattered. 1 full turn per 2 seconds, Sarah said. "Count it out. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. We're looking for the pressure in the D system to climb gradually. Watch the gauge on the tertiary system readout, the one in front of you, Captain." Hayes was watching the gauge intently. The pressure had been dropping steadily, but now, as Chen slowly opened the backup accumulator valve, he could see the rate of pressure loss beginning to decrease. "Pressure stabilizing," he reported, and for the first time there was something like hope in his voice. "Still dropping, but much more slowly." "Keep opening," Sarah instructed Chen, "but maintain the timing, 2 seconds per turn." The aircraft continued to shudder and groan, but Sarah found herself entering a state of focused clarity. There was no fear now, only the crystalline certainty of knowledge being applied to a real-world emergency. Every procedure she'd memorized, every simulator session, every night spent in her father's study learning the intricacies of aircraft systems, it was all converging in this moment. "The pressure in the D system should be climbing," Sarah said. "When it reaches 1,000 psi, you need to flip the quaternary system isolation switch from isolated to active. Captain, can you see that switch from your position?" Hayes stretched, his eyes scanning the overhead panel. He found it, a switch marked with red and white labels, currently positioned in the isolated position. "I see it," he confirmed. "Don't flip it yet," Sarah instructed. "First Officer Chen, keep the accumulator valve opening at the same rate. Sarah will tell you when to stop and when the captain should flip the isolation switch." The moment stretched out. The aircraft continued to fly, but it was flying with degraded control authority. Every maneuver required more effort from Captain Hayes, but slowly, methodically, the pressure in the quaternary system climbed. 1,000 psi, 1,100 psi, 1,150 psi. Now, Sarah said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who absolutely knew what needed to happen. Captain Hayes, flip the quaternary isolation switch to active. Hayes moved with instant precision. The switch flipped. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the quaternary hydraulic system engaged. The gauges shimmered. New system parameters appeared on the displays. The aircraft responded. The flight control surfaces, which had been sluggish and unresponsive, suddenly began responding with greater authority to Hayes's control inputs. Hydraulic pressure is stable, First Officer Chen reported, her voice filled with amazed relief. All remaining systems showing green, control authority restored. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear the change in the aircraft's behavior. The terrified groaning of a machine struggling against failure had been replaced by something different, the confident hum of a functioning aircraft. Sarah Mitchell, 11 years old, had just saved Flight 447 the seconds after Captain Hayes flipped the quaternary isolation switch felt like they stretched into hours. Sarah could see the tension in both pilots' faces as they waited to see if the procedure would work. The aircraft continued its labored flight, still groaning under the stress of partially failed systems, still requiring constant compensation from Hayes's firm grip on the control yoke. "Come on," First Officer Chen whispered, as if encouraging the aircraft itself to respond to their intervention. The pressure gauge for the quaternary system climbed, 900 psi, 950 psi, 1,000 psi. Sarah watched the numbers with absolute focus, her mind running through the procedure once more, checking each step against the reality of what was happening. "Pressure climbing," Captain Hayes reported, his voice still tight with uncertainty. "Still within acceptable parameters, but we need full stabilization." "It's going to work," Sarah said, and the certainty in her voice seemed to steady both pilots. "The accumulator has enough charge. The isolation procedure prevents system cross-contamination. You're going to have full hydraulic authority in another 30 seconds." The aircraft shuddered violently, and for a moment, Sarah felt her confidence waver. What if she'd miscalculated? What if the pressure surge she'd warned against was happening anyway? What if the systems weren't compatible after the partial failure? But she pushed the doubt away. She'd studied this. Her father had taught her. The procedure was sound. Then something changed in the aircraft's behavior. The constant sluggishness that had characterized the control inputs vanished. Captain Hayes moved the yoke slightly to the left, and the aircraft responded instantly, not with the delayed, reluctant response it had been giving, but with the crisp, immediate reaction of a healthy aircraft responding to pilot input. "She's responding," Hayes said, wonder creeping into his voice. Full control authority returning to normal. The constant droning alarm that had been their soundtrack throughout the emergency suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound could have been. In the absence of the alarm, there was only the normal sound of aircraft systems operating as they should, the steady drone of the engines, the whisper of air across the fuselage, the subtle sounds of hydraulic fluid moving through properly functioning systems. Sarah felt something inside her release, tension she hadn't even fully acknowledged she was carrying. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had been propelling her starting to wear off. She gripped the edge of a nearby console to steady herself. "All hydraulic systems showing stable pressure," First Officer Chen confirmed, and Sarah could hear tears in her voice now. "Green across the board, all systems responding normally." Captain Hayes took a deep breath, the first truly deep breath Sarah had heard from him since she'd entered the cockpit. He gripped the yoke for one more moment, then released it, stretching his fingers. His hands were white from the strain of holding the control yoke with such intensity for so long. "You did it," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "Whatever you did, it worked." Sarah wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The enormity of what had just happened was starting to settle over her. She hadn't just explained a procedure. She'd actually guided two professional pilots through the implementation of an emergency repair while flying an aircraft at 35,000 feet. She'd made the difference between 189 people surviving or... She couldn't finish that thought. "Sarah, are you all right?" Chen asked, and Sarah realized the first officer was looking at her with concern. The young girl had gone pale, the shock of the moment catching up with her. "I'm okay," Sarah whispered. "Is the aircraft really stable now?" "Watch," Hayes said. He adjusted the trim control with practiced precision, small, deliberate movements that adjusted the aircraft's pitch without requiring constant control input. When he removed his hands from the yoke completely, the aircraft maintained its altitude and heading perfectly. Full autopilot systems are back online. The aircraft is flying normally. In the cabin, the reaction to the sudden silence was immediate and overwhelming. Passengers had been sitting in darkness punctuated by flashing emergency lights, listening to the constant wail of alarms, feeling the aircraft struggle against what they all understood was catastrophic mechanical failure. Then, like a switch being flipped, everything changed. The alarms stopped. The chaotic turbulence smoothed out. The aircraft responded to the pilot's gentle touch as if nothing had ever been wrong. For a moment there was complete silence. Then someone started crying, not in fear but in relief. The sound seemed to break a dam. Throughout the cabin, people began to cry, to embrace each other, to offer quiet prayers of thanksgiving. In seat 14B, Sarah's mother had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that ranged from despair to relief, to the overwhelming emotion of knowing that her daughter had just done something extraordinary. In seat 14D, Colonel James Mitchell sat with tears streaming openly down his face. His daughter, his smart, dedicated, prepared daughter, had taken everything he'd taught her and used it to save an aircraft. The businessman in 12C began applauding, slowly at first, then with more intensity. Other passengers joined in. Within moments, the entire cabin was applauding, a spontaneous, overwhelming expression of gratitude and relief. The lead flight attendant, Maria Gonzalez, pressed the intercom. "Captain, the cabin is celebrating. What happened? What did that girl do?" "She saved our lives," Captain Hayes replied, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who understood exactly how close they'd come to catastrophe. "Get her back here, and tell the cabin we're heading directly to Denver International for an emergency landing. We need to get everyone on the ground and get these systems professionally inspected." As Sarah made her way back to the cockpit door, First Officer Chen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," Chen said simply. That was the most remarkable thing I've ever witnessed." Sarah didn't trust her voice to work, so she simply nodded. The cockpit door opened and Sarah stepped back into the cabin. She was immediately engulfed in the attention of every passenger in the aircraft. Cameras appeared, passengers recording on their phones. The flight attendants surrounded her, asking questions, checking to make sure she was all right. But she moved through the cabin as if in a dream, returning to her seat where her parents waited. Her mother pulled her into an embrace so tight it almost hurt, sobbing against her daughter's hair. Her father held them both, his own tears unchecked, his expression a mixture of pride and awe and the overwhelming relief of a parent whose child has done something impossible and survived. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, saying it over and over. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." Sarah sat between her parents as the aircraft turned toward Denver, toward safety, toward an emergency landing that would be nothing compared to what they'd already survived. Around her, the cabin had taken on a different atmosphere, no longer the chaotic fear of an emergency, but the cautious hope of people who had come back from the brink. The aircraft that had nearly been lost was flying smoothly now, its systems restored, its pilots grateful beyond words, its crew and passengers understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. And at the center of it all was an 11-year-old girl who had studied hard, listened carefully, and when the moment came, had possessed both the knowledge and the courage to do what needed to be done. The descent into Denver International Airport was handled with extraordinary care and precision. Captain Hayes was taking no chances with an aircraft that had just experienced multiple hydraulic system failures. He communicated directly with air traffic control, providing detailed information about the emergency and requesting the longest available runway and all available emergency equipment standing by. "Denver approach, Flight 447, he reported, his voice still carrying the weight of what they'd endured. "We're descending through 15,000 feet, all systems stable, but we've experienced catastrophic hydraulic failure. We're looking at an emergency landing with full emergency services on standby." The response from the control tower was immediate. "Flight 447, you are cleared for immediate descent to runway 35 left. Emergency services will be standing by. We'll have everything ready for you." In the cabin, passengers watched through the windows as the landscape below gradually resolved from abstract patterns into recognizable terrain. The mountains of Colorado came into focus, then the sprawling metropolis of Denver itself. Sarah pressed her face to the window in her seat, watching the world rise to meet them. She felt strangely detached from it all, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold rather than living her own. Her mother held her hand tightly, and her father sat across the aisle, his eyes never leaving his daughter. He was the only person on the aircraft who fully understood what Sarah had just accomplished, not in the abstract, dramatic way that the other passengers understood it, but in the technical, deeply personal way that came from having taught her everything she'd used to save them. As they descended through 5,000 feet, Captain Hayes made one final announcement to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Denver International. I want to personally thank everyone for their patience and composure during this emergency. We are especially grateful to one very special passenger who provided critical technical expertise that allowed us to stabilize our aircraft. We would not be here without her knowledge, courage, and composure. Thank you all for flying with us." The cabin erupted in applause once more, and Sarah felt her face flush bright red. This public acknowledgement of what she'd done was more overwhelming than the actual emergency had been. The landing itself was flawless. Captain Hayes brought Flight 447 down with such gentle precision that many passengers barely felt the moment the wheels touched the runway. As soon as they were on the ground, emergency vehicles began moving into position. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue vehicles standing ready for an emergency that, thanks to Sarah's intervention, never needed to happen. The aircraft taxied slowly to the gate, and as it came to a stop, the cabin erupted in cheers. When Captain Hayes opened the cockpit door and stepped out, the first thing he did was walk directly to row 14, where Sarah sat with her parents. He extended his hand to the 11-year-old girl who had saved his aircraft. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion, "on behalf of myself, my entire crew, and every passenger on this aircraft, I want to thank you. You did something today that I've never seen before and pray I'll never need to see again. You demonstrated knowledge, courage, and composure far beyond your years. You saved lives today." Sarah shook his hand, her small fingers gripping his with surprising strength. First Officer Maria Chen was right behind him, embracing Sarah gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." As the aircraft doors opened and passengers began to disembark, they were met with a scene unlike any of them had ever witnessed. The terminal was packed with people, airport staff, emergency personnel, news crews that had already heard rumors of the dramatic in-flight emergency. As soon as Sarah stepped onto the jet bridge, surrounded by her parents, the cameras began flashing. News reporters surged toward her, microphones extended, shouting questions. Sarah, how did you know what to do? Did you train specifically for this? How does it feel to have saved 189 lives? Can you tell us about the emergency procedure? Sarah's parents immediately moved to shield her from the worst of the media crush, but they couldn't prevent the overwhelming nature of the moment. Airport security moved in quickly, creating a protective corridor that allowed the family to move toward the terminal. By midnight, Sarah's face was on every news network in the country. The story was irresistible. An 11-year-old aviation enthusiast who had studied aircraft systems so thoroughly that she was able to guide experienced pilots through an unprecedented emergency. News anchors struggled to find the right adjectives. Incredible, heroic, remarkable, one of the most extraordinary moments in aviation history. Her father's training program became the focus of fascination. Interviews were conducted about how Colonel James Mitchell had taught his daughter, what motivated him to provide such advanced technical knowledge to a child, how he'd prepared her for something he could never have anticipated would happen in real life. Sarah herself gave brief statements to the media, but her parents were careful to limit her exposure. She was still just a child, even if she was now a famous one. In the days that followed, there were offers, book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements, sponsorship opportunities. College programs wanted to recruit her before she'd even finished middle school. The National Transportation Safety Board wanted to conduct interviews about the emergency procedure to ensure the Boeing 737 emergency protocols were optimized. But in the quiet moments back at their home in Denver, Sarah was still just Sarah. She returned to her notebook, still filled with sketches and notes about aircraft systems. She returned to her flight simulator. She returned to her evening sessions with her father, studying the technical aspects of aviation. 1 week after the emergency, Sarah received a visit from the Federal Aviation Administration. Representatives brought official documentation recognizing her for her contribution to aviation safety. Her name was added to the FAA's list of civilian contributors to emergency response excellence. More significantly, Captain Robert Hayes personally called to invite Sarah to visit the aircraft that she'd saved. She went with her father, and standing in the cockpit of Flight 447, in calm circumstances rather than during an emergency, the reality of what she'd accomplished became crystal clear. This was a real aircraft. These were real systems, and she had genuinely saved this machine and everyone aboard it. Captain Hayes stood with her in the cockpit and placed his hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said, "I've been flying for 32 years. I've thought about retirement, but after what you did, after watching you demonstrate such remarkable knowledge and courage, I've decided to keep flying. I want to be the kind of pilot that people like you need in the cockpit. You reminded me why I loved flying in the first place." The media storm gradually subsided over the following months. Sarah became a minor celebrity, the girl who saved an airplane. But what was more important was what happened in the aviation community itself. Her story became a teaching tool. Flight schools used her case to demonstrate the importance of understanding aircraft systems at a deep level. Her father's approach to technical education began to be studied and emulated by others. The specific emergency procedure she'd guided the pilots through was incorporated into Boeing 737 training programs for commercial pilots. By the time Sarah turned 12, a year after the emergency, she'd been interviewed by every major news outlet, had received hundreds of letters from people she'd inspired, and had become something of an ambassador for aviation science and engineering to young people across the country. But the most meaningful recognition came quietly, in the cockpit of Flight 447, when Captain Hayes handed her something on her birthday. Her own airline captain's wings, not the gold ones worn by certified pilots, but special commemorative wings engraved with her name and the date of the emergency. "These are for when you're old enough to earn the real ones," he said with a smile. "And Sarah, I have absolutely no doubt that you will." Sarah Mitchell, 11 years old turning 12, held those wings in her hands and understood something profound. Preparation meets opportunity. Knowledge combined with courage creates heroes. And sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin not with training for something specific, but with the simple commitment to understanding the world deeply and completely. She was just a girl with a dream of flying, but she had become something more. She had become living proof that dedication, study, and courage could change the world. The end.